This week in the meta, Control failed to clinch. Fairies reign rampant, but domains are Grinch.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below as we navigate through Week 7's metagame changes. Now let's untap. Alrighty, so in Tier 1 world, Dimir Fae has risen from the depths to join the usual staple archetypes of Domain, Esper Midrange, and Azorius Soldiers, and Mono Red has also finally pushed through the hate and joined the ranks.
Meanwhile, in Tier 2, Bant Control and Golgari Aggro stabilized from their fall, and Esper Control angled for a comeback, but fell short this week.
And last but not least, in Brewer's Corner, we have the latest spicy tech development in Standard with Gruul Aggro and a few interesting submissions from viewers to discuss. But I think we're going to kick things off right now by breaking down what happened this week for the Tier 1 archetypes, starting with Domain. So Shan Zhu, or Shan Zhao, don't know how to pronounce it, apologies, piloted Domain through the 152-man 10K in Dallas, Texas this past weekend, with another 2 copies in the top 8 over there as well. There isn't really that much that's changed about this list. The depopulates disappeared from the main in favor of the additional turn 2 removal and the return of the 4th invasion of Zendikar, but even the sideboard has been mostly the same lately. Now, Beekeeper took a slightly different iteration to the finals of the MTGO Showcase Challenge, pushing a Chromehost Seed Shark into the main and bumping up the Go for the Throats to 3, while going with only 2 Invasion of Zendikars and 1 Courier's Briefcase. So it's been a minute, honestly, Max, since we've seen any back-breaking innovations for this deck, and until the next set comes in with Cavern of Souls, I'm not really expecting any, but I do think it's interesting that we see different iterations of this deck, some with Depopulate, some without Depopulate, some with 3 Go for the Throats, some with only 2 Invasion of Zendikars. Like, we're seeing those flex slots shift heavily as we get through and close to the end of the season here.
Yeah, Chromehost Seed Shark, certainly an interesting addition to that flex slot. I'm starting to see only 4 board wipes this week as opposed to 6 last week. Is that signaling anything? What's going on with the deck right now?
I think if it signals anything, it's that they expect more mirror matches. When you go heavier on Invasion of Zendikars and you start to relent on those depopulates, you're saying, I expect to see domain mirrors, and I want to make sure that I'm hitting Topiary Stomper into Invasion of Zendikar at the highest probability possible. Whereas when you go to the Beekeeper side and they are on 3 Go for the Throats and they're cutting down Invasions and cutting down Courier's Briefcase, what I'm seeing is Depopulate's too slow. We need to kill things on turn 2 with a little bit more regularity, or at least have Go for the Throats by turn 3, depending on how that math works out.
Okay. Talk to us about newcomer to the tier list, Dimir Fae.
So in far more exciting news, Dimir is back on top, pushing the limits with fairies this time, and a truly absurd amount of low-end board wipes in the sideboard. As you may notice, you see all these glistening deluges and malicious malfunctions. Good God. Charlie took down the MTGO Showcase Challenge over the weekend with their innovative list, and you love to see it. The key, it appears, is the Picklock Prankster, pushing into this 2-drop, as we're going to feature it right here, and providing a blue kind of Mosswood Dread Knight vibe for us. The fact that it's able to give us that card advantage before coming down as a 1/3 fairy that's going to give you additional cards off of Kaido and Gix while activating Talion's Messenger in kind of a mini Rafine-like era. It's a really key role without seeming like it's that powerful, but it seems to be the pivotal fairy that we've needed to get this archetype up and running, and I love to see it. Now, the single Trespasser in the main, it's a bit odd considering most of our board is full of flyers, but I love the single Gix with all this evasion. And I can see where this list is positioned to attack Domain and Soldiers efficiently. So I love what they're doing with fairies here. I can't wait to see next week's evolution.
All right, yeah, I dig seeing Fae and Dimir Fae in Tier 1. I really like that. Can you tell me, though, why, as opposed to past versions of this deck, why it uses 3 Dream Thieves? I could think of other uses for that slot, 4th Talion Messenger, Halo Foragers, perhaps, to get some of those disruptive spells value back into the deck. What's the reasoning on that one?
So it's hard to say, but my guess is right now we look at the list and we see 14 fairies in the main board. That's almost 1 fairy every 4 cards. It's a little bit less than that, but not by much. And I think that's the point, is that you want to see basically 2 fairies in the top 8 or 9 cards, and so we don't necessarily need to go into the 15th fairy. My guess is there was some math done, and they realized they wanted one shore up more than they wanted the 4th Dream Thief, because that's really where that slot would come from. And my guess on the shore up is that they looked at that and said, Fairy Dream Thief is mostly there to enable some early aggression, a little bit of late game value, and mostly you want to enable fairy fencing and pump up those spell stutters, right? But shore up, if you have any other fairy, is going to protect the better fairy, which I think is the point of it. So my guess is they went that way.
Okay. That actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Having that early aggression and having an early fairy makes a lot of sense within the synergy of the deck. Okay. Talk to us about Esper Midrange.
So Esper didn't take home any trophies this weekend, but it did take up half of the MTGO Showcase's top 8, while also grabbing a slot at the SCG 10K in Dallas, Texas. Now, here we're featuring the top 4 list by Bernastores, and the main board here, what I think is most intriguing, there's no Shelly. In fact, the entire deck has eschewed the big bad Shelly, and on the sideboard what we're seeing is this push into Razorlash Transmogrant, perhaps in response to the domain list pushing those Go for the Throats and Depopulates lately. And this deck saying, no, we will be aggressive, we will have Recursion, you don't get to just wrath the board with those 4 mana wraths and those 2 mana removal spells. We are going to force a Sunfall to deal with this card. So I really like where this list is trying to position itself. The fact that it's gone lower on average on the curve, like we're seeing the full 4 Fairy Masterminds, but we're only seeing 2 Wandering Emperors, we're seeing 0 Shellys, as we said, and we've pushed into another Lord Skitter to go a little bit wider and push a little bit more into this token theme. I think that's interesting that we've moved more into a token deck now.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that, considering only the 2 white Virtue cards. I used to say 3 or 4. I don't know. I have to ask. Really, the card I'm wondering about, even over that, is Emperor. Why only 2 copies? I know we've been fans of more copies in the past. Is there anything you'd push out for that, or is 2 copies okay?
Well, I think the 3rd Emperor took a backseat to the 2nd Lord Skitter, which might indicate that we are dealing with an uptick in Cauldron decks and a concern for the graveyard, as well as an acknowledgement that we just need to get on the board and go faster, and that this deck is more tempo-based than we had originally positioned it. That's why I think this is an important iteration to look at compared to the usual Esper Midrange, because the old logic of it is you just play the best cards on value up the curve, like Dennick, Rafine, Shelly, still the best thing to do, and that was how Esper Legends operated, and Esper Midrange was kind of just a derivation of that, where we said, okay, we like what Legends is doing, we want that power curve, but we want a little more flexibility in dealing with our opponent, instead of just praying that we have the curve out that works every time, right? And this is an acknowledgement that maybe we don't even need Shelly anymore. With all the removal, all the Go for the Throats, maybe the answer is to have a diversification of threats that can't be answered with Go for the Throat, because you don't really care if any of these creatures individually gets answered the way you would if Shelly gets answered. And I'll be honest with you, I have sideboarded out Shelly in the mirror match almost every time for this exact reason. They're going to have removal spells. There's no reason to turn those removal spells on when you can have a diversification of threats that they can't answer.
Yeah, definitely. I understand the logic. I understand the line of reasoning. Wow. Now talk to us about Azorius Soldiers, because this deck presents a different line of reasoning from the typical aggro list. What's going on with it?
So Ashton Evans made it to the final of the SCG 10K with Azorius Soldiers, where they were joined in the top 8 by a few other Azorius pilots, and I'm going to note there's just very little evolution here as well. The return of Bunnicorn and Yodian Frontliner into the main, shaving that Singleton Protect the Negotiators from the main, and that second copy of Werefox Bodyguard, which suggests kind of a more aggressive stance for this build. The sideboard also cuts back on Lantern Flares, if you'll note, and it features Elspeth Smite here as a 2-of over 2 of those Lantern Flares. And to me, this suggests that we want to get out and run again. Like, this is a deck that is going to be aggressive, wants to be aggressive, and we're not expecting as many control decks. We're not expecting necessarily as much domain as we were in past weeks, which I'm not sure that that's correct, but that seems to be how this is positioned when you start cutting counters out of the main that are clearly there for control and clearly there for domain, and they're sitting in the sideboard now, but the Bunnicorn's back, which, again, that is a sign that we want to go all in on aggression. We just want a big fat 6/6 to smack their teeth in, you know?
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I've been meaning to ask this for a while about the deck. What's with the 3 Takazi's Welcome in the sideboard? I know that's a useful card, but what matchup are they specifically for?
So I think Takazia's Welcome is going to be dependent on play versus draw. For some matchups, like Esper Midrange, I think on the play, I like it quite a bit because you can get into these cycles where you are just pumping out threats and pushing right past them. But if we're on the draw, the threat of them you can't have a dead turn on turn 3 on the draw against them. You know what I mean? Like, they'll just go into Rafine and run you out of the house. You have to have answers there. So I think it's much more of a play versus draw card, typically. But some matchups where I'd want it in either scenario, Golgari Aggro, I would probably want it, as long as they aren't following what I would do, which is play way too much enchantment removal. I want the Takazia's Welcome against any of those decks because you can just grind them out. You can just play a creature a turn, draw an extra card a turn. You can see how over the course of 3 or 4 turns, you're going to see 3 or 4 extra cards. As long as there isn't a Shelly on the battlefield, you're just winning.
Yeah, that value matchup with Golgari is important, and I think that it's good of you to point out because I don't think that gets talked about enough. All right, talk to us about the last list in Tier 1, Mono Red.
So there was one top 8 appearance in the showcase by Easy Myth, Yes Myth, I don't know. Anyway, along with trophies from Rap Solo 61-person tournament and the Swiss BO3 Nothing But Land tourney, means that Mono Red has finally achieved Tier 1 status once more. 2 trophies in a top 8 will give it. The list I'm featuring is none of those. I want to be clear about that. This is actually from a semi-pro grinder who got into day 2 of the qualifier piloting this exact list. And I've played it a bit. I love the logic behind how it sideboards and what it's aiming to do currently. Those 5 main board answers to Shieldred, which goes up to 9 on the back of the Bloodthirsty Adversaries, it transitions beautifully into Furnace Punishers or Koths as need be. So if they're not playing Shelly, we have natural, like, out for Nahiri's Warcraft, in for Furnace Punisher. You know, like, let's just start punishing those tricolor mana bases. It's really well thought out. That's what I like about it. Like, you have the 4 Invasion of Tarkir, you have the 4 Lithomanic Barrage to say, okay, soldiers, we're ready for you this time. We have what we need to keep you in check until we can go over. So it's just beautifully done, honestly. That's why I put it over all the other ones that have trophies, because I think this one was the strongest list of the weekend.
I honestly, I kind of concur a little bit. And seeing Furnace Punisher back, wow. But I have to ask, which direction should the deck go in for the current meta? Being that the meta has turned aggressive in a way, I do like Monstrous Rage for the Godric's, for the Celebration, and Swift Spear as well for the Prowess. Do you think the Celebration mechanic is a good way to lean towards for this deck? You know, cards like the Battle Mice. What do you think about that?
I can tell you that nothing feels better than playing Monstrous Rage to counter Cut Down. Nothing on this planet feels as good as that for for Mono Red, where they try to blow up your Swift Spear and you're like, actually take 6. You know, yeah. Like, it feels pretty fucking good. I mean, it's Mono Red. You have to be aggressive. You have to be the aggro. Do you go hyper? Do you try to kick it back a little bit? A lot of people have opinions on that. I've seen so many Mono Red players that go with Urabrask's Forge. Even Darth Zero is all in on Urabrask's Forge. And honestly, if they had shifted Urabrask's Forge so that it started with a 2-1 instead of a 1-1, I would be on that train permanently. But I think the fact that it takes that extra turn to get into a range where it actually starts to matter, it's deadly in a lot of matchups. So I prefer moving faster. I like that we're only on 2 Monstrous Rage for the simple fact that we have our Godric's, but we also don't want to give up play with fires. We don't necessarily want to give up those early pieces of removal, and we can't give up any more creature slots. So we have to be able and willing to give up removal slots if we're going to go into Monstrous Rage, which, again, we have Bloodthirsty Adversaries, so even if we have 2 Monstrous Rage, it's kind of like we have 4.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. I do like Monstrous Rage. That's probably my favorite card from the list as far as recent additions go. But that'll do it for Tier 1. Let's jump down into Tier 2, and I'll kick things off with Esper Control. So, Terabad, aka Carl Serap, stormed their way to the Final Four of the MTGO Showcase with Esper Control, but didn't seal the deal in the end. No other copies could be found across our weekend of tournaments, so we've placed the archetype in Tier 2 for now. Notable cards from this iteration include Siphon Insight, which signals a return to a few selective colors, mid-range archetypes populating the field. And as we've said in the past, this card is typically for a meta that consumes itself, as has been said, kind of like Ouroboros, with a few select cards dominating the majority of the list. And you can already think of some of those targets like Shelly's, Glissas, juicy bits of removal, or counter spells from your opponent. Now, I would not personally go over 2 copies in any list right now, however, as I consider that an overinvestment. Dissipate and Void Ren with, the Exile effect signal that there's graveyard play going on presently, and I'd like to point out that Virtue of Persistence starting to see a little bit more play than the typical 1 copy, and it's landing in late portions of games more often than you would think. So great tools against awkward creatures with Ward that you may run into from time to time. And finally, just before I close out, I want to point out the 1 copy of Jason in the main board, the 2 in the sideboard, signaling that Mill has come back as an alternative win con in really tight control mirror matchups.
Yeah, and I mean, as you know, Jace was kind of a mirror breaker for Domain for a few weeks here, so I can see where Control is going, all right, we're going to deal with Domain with Jaces, and that's going to be how we handle that, post-board especially. But my question for you is this actually a Tier 1 archetype, or does it benefit predominantly when people don't focus on it?
I do believe it does. Similarly to Mono Red, I think this list, especially when nobody builds towards it in the sideboard, does tend to benefit. And I think it tends to benefit from a very control dominant meta, which I wouldn't say we're seeing a control dominant meta, but we're seeing some significant control decks in Tier 1, Tier 2 that are giving all the other decks problems. And so I think that's why this has risen in the past couple weeks.
Fair. Well, let's take things over to Golgari Aggro and tell us all about it.
All right, so Joshua Willis took his copy of Golgari to the finals of the SCG 10K trial the night before the main event in Dallas. Another copy landed in top 8 as well, giving this a spot in at least Tier 2 this week. Now, Golgari continues to be a popular deck for the standard MTGA meta, as MTGA Assistant has pointed out with its data that it shares the top most populated deck with the Esper color set. Now, while the deck continues to utilize the same creatures and tool sets as before with Shelly, Graveyard Trespassers, Mosswood Dread Knights, especially full play sets of, there's now the notable addition of Liliana's and Outland Liberators. I'm unsure about the addition of Lily personally, as this has been outshined by the addition of, the Soldiers list to the meta, but also recursive creature threats like Tenacious Underdog coming back and Dread Knight. Liberators are there for the same reason we used to see Terra Sunders, the Beanstalk and Domain based lists. Now, while we've been on the fence regarding the Tortoise, 3 to me seems like a steep investment. Remember though that these tend to be paired with a full playset of Restless Cottages and other high mana value plays, thus in this deck being the full playset, Nissa, and 2 instead of 1 copy of Virtue of Persistence.
So, Max, when you consider Golgari makes up, I mean, like you said, it's tied for #1 with Esper on making up the highest percentage in the meta right now. But when you look at Domain and you look at Golgari, is there a compelling reason to play Golgari over Domain, in your opinion?
I think, right, it's meta dependent. That's the easy way out. But really, I think that Golgari does well when Domain isn't as present. And unfortunately, I don't think that's the case right now. Part of the reason that we're seeing it in Tier 2 is that you are starting to see a rise in Domain. So, yeah, I don't know. If Domain comes down a little bit, Golgari becomes just a bit more popular.
Well, let's turn to a deck that Golgari also somewhat struggles with and talk about Bant Control here.
Yes, definitely. What a beautifully built deck. Parker Goff made it to the top 8 of the SCG 10K trial with Bant Control, as did William Barlin. And now, while the mana bases in these 2 decks differ, the core concept remains the same. Beanstalks and bindings all day, baby. The exile-based removal in March and lay down arms, again signaling the denial of the graveyard recursion that we're seeing. So many good cards trigger Beanstalk. It's really no wonder this deck is still based on that card. You got Sunfalls, you got Syncopates, you got March that you can overpay a little bit for. But let's not forget the one of that many people don't even see coming still to this day, Invasion of New Phyrexia. Love using that card. But let's not undersell this deck. We also have 3 copies of Chrome Host Seed Shark, and I think that is, the main win con of the list is trying to get value from that card.
Yeah, we've seen a shift from Horny Lock Whales over to Seed Sharks. It's gone down on curve, so to speak. So I'm intrigued by that. But my question for you here, Max, is: are we worried that there's a tension point between these Chrome Host Seed Sharks and all these Wrath effects with Sunfalls?
Yeah, you would think so if you have a creature value engine and you have a bunch of board wipes that tends to be in tension with each other. But in this case, Chrome Host does provide some added value when you play your Sunfalls, giving you the potential for 2/5/5 creatures there that survive after that. So I still think you get enough value from the Chrome Host to warrant their inclusion.
Fair. And with that, we are going to move into our next segment, my favorite, Brewer's Corner. Let's kick things
Let's
off
go.
with a really sweet Gruul Aggro deck brought to us by 10Tu. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm sorry, guys. Anyway, what I like about this is actually a really, really cool way of shifting that Cacophony Scamp Goblins deck that we saw last week and saying, okay, Picnic Ruiner and Cacophony Scamp are the focal points. Like the fact that this gets Double Strike. And just bear with me here. What happens when we put Audacities and it gets Double Strike as a 4/2? All of a sudden we have Trample, we have Double Strike. You see all these ways that we have to make these Cacophony Scamps and these Picnic Ruiners and these Questing Druids huge. And we're kind of playing a weird Ride the Queen to Victory is the old like motif back in the day. You know, like Boggles was based on that. Aura decks were based on that. Like take one creature, ramp it up in power, and just hope it rides to victory on its own. And this has that same kind of vibe, but I think it's a lot faster. Because Cacophony Scamp essentially has Double Strike when it hits, and Picnic Ruiner gets Double Strike quickly. Questing Druid pumps itself with everything you're doing while giving you card advantage. I love where this list is. I haven't gotten a chance to try it, but it looks spicy as hell. And it's just the coolest thing I've seen in Standard in a minute. So props to you, 10Tu.
Yeah, and any props to anybody who can make Gruul relevant again in Standard. I love that color set and what it does for the aggressive archetype. So props to you for that as well. But let's talk about another aggressive list that does things a little bit differently. Simic Modified. Now, honestly, looking at this list, I didn't exactly, upon first look, I didn't know exactly what it was trying to do, but I do see a couple of key cards that indicate what it's trying to do with Training Grounds and a lot of these artifact creatures that have abilities such as Incubate, the Arm Guard Familiar being a full play set. It is trying to take advantage of the fact that there are artifacts in the list with Teething Wormlet. And Tough Cookie by itself in the mono-green list anyway, I've been using that as a win con all on its own. And I'm also very curious about the inclusion of Feral Encounter as a fight spell that allows you to basically get something from the top 5 of your library. It adds a little bit of value to the typical fight spell, and it being a double green. In a Simic list, I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. But nonetheless, this list seems to have some self-synergies. Is there anything about this list you want to point out, Dark, that I'm not seeing?
Well, first of all, credit to Matt961. Thank you for submitting it. What I like about this is Training Grounds plus Tough Cookie seems great.
Okay,
the ability to turn that like 1 green and all your artifacts turn into 4/4 artifact creatures until end of turn. That seems like it could go nuts if you have just a few Incubate tokens. I want to shift this list a lot. It looks like a really interesting rough draft of the concept, but this is far from a final draft. Viewers, take a look at it. Grab it off Moxfield, play with it, tune it a little bit. I think this actually has some potential. Yeah. It just needs a lot of work.
There's some things in here I'm just noticing, like Training Grounds benefits Drafna, the blue legendary artifact. You can return artifacts, but copying artifact spells as well. Like I can see that definitely benefiting an aggro archetype. So I don't know, man. I want to play with it because artifact decks aren't around in current Standard, and there's so many things from Brothers War and past sets that supplement that.
Yeah,
but
Sunfall sure kept a lot of that shit in check. Anyway,
it really did.
Alrighty, so I built this one based on some different things that were submitted over the last few weeks. So for all the people that submitted variants on Chaotic Transformation, thank you. I wish I could remember everybody's names to give them credit, but just universal thank you. You know who you are. This is my iteration of it. It's a very different iteration than we initially started with, I believe, green in here as well. And I shifted right out of that very quickly and realized what I want in Chaotic Transformation is Portal to Phyrexia over everything else. Like, I just want to land a Portal to Phyrexia, and this plays like Indomitable Creativity does in Explorer. It's just not as good because you don't have Fable, and you don't have a few of those other key cards that really make Chaotic Transformation, which is just another version of Indomitable in so many ways. It doesn't have the same payoffs, but it has a lot of payoffs nonetheless. Like the ability to just go counter your shit with flip the switch into chaotic grab Atraxa, that's a big game. There's a lot of ways that this deck can mess with your opponent, but if they know it's coming, it's pretty hard to win through the counter war. Once they get Make Disappears up and running, good luck resolving Chaotic Transformation, which is why it's a brew and not a tier 1 deck.
Oh, man. Well, let's talk about, again, an artifact list, Esper Vehicles by Heady Steve. This list, oh man, it features some mechanics that long forgotten in Standard. Kamigawa introduced a whole set of mecha cards, and in the 1-drop slot, Kitsune Ace, an enabler of this list. But I want to just point out a couple. Mobilizer Mech and Mindlink Mech both can create some shenanigans if you have the right cards to synergize within the deck. And I see that it's making use of Greasefang, Akiba Boss. So I can already tell just from looking at this with Surge Hacker, a 3 of, as well, that you're really trying to overrun with mechs. You're trying to get a lot of value out of them with Surge Hacker Mech, and basically just leave your opponent stunned by turn 4 with a lot of damage coming through, and some of it with evasion. So I can see what this deck's trying to do, especially with the copies of Duress and Pilfer to kind of defend itself from the control strategies out there. Y'all let us know if you can pilot this deck to a tier 2 status, because I'd really like to see an artifact, especially a mecha-based list, in the top 2 tiers.
Yeah, Thundersteel Colossus ain't quite Parhelion, but there is a lot to be said about this, and the fact that Restoration of a Ganjo does such a nice role with Greasefang, where turn 3 you just set up your Greasefang by discarding like a Surge Hacker Mech and then going into Greasefang on your turn and starting to push that tempo. That's pretty interesting to me. So there's some spicy little combos in there. Again, a deck that I think needs tuning, a deck that needs some work, but has potential. So we'll see what happens as the weeks go on. However, that will bring us to our final segment, predictions for the upcoming week. Now, Max, we've looked at, I believe, another 12 archetypes tonight. What are your predictions going into week 8 of Wild Standard?
Well, to be honest with you, I take a look at both the tiers. I wonder if we'll see some of the decks that have been, getting some discussion online outside of this meta. Archetypes that come in might spoil the fun in these last few weeks of Wild Standard. One I've yet to see pop up often enough in top 8 Sworn Inclusion is Sultai Midrange. Now, we've all seen the Crokies list, which 5 and 2'd in the qualifier. And I wonder if Golgari is doing well enough by itself, why can't a Golgari list that allows, splashes for blue, for some counter spells, and maybe some useful fairies to add evasion to the deck's aggression? I don't know. Why can't it do the same? I'm also thinking about Dimir and Riktus. Are they going to make a showing in either aggro or mid-range form? They've been noticeably absent from the discussion in light of Golgari Aggro's rise to prominence. And one has to wonder, what that deck has that these other color pairings do not. What about Mono Black Aggro? What about the Cauldron decks? I do really hope that you'll tune in these last few weeks of this Wild's meta to see how these archetypes adjust, how they adapt. And I also hope, actually, that some of you out there give those off-meta lists a run so we can feature you in the State of the Meta. Speaking of, head on down to the comments. Let us know what you think about anything we've discussed today. And while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe and consider joining the rebellion. For just the little payment of $1 a month, you can hit the join button and join us in our efforts to bring more quality content to this channel. We really do appreciate the support that those of you who've already joined in the past week have shown us. Thank you so much for that. And now, you've really heard enough from me. What, if any, predictions or surprises do you have for us this week, Dark Riktus?
Okay, so I tested all the Tier 1 decks in more than a few brews this past weekend in the hopes of toppling the Jankathon, which, due to Arena's Direct Challenges glitch, did not end up firing. But to that end, I will go ahead and show you a little Riktus revision on what I would have run and why. So, surprise, surprise, Esper Midrange. There are a few key pieces to notice here on my build versus usual builds. The first is there's no Plaza of Heroes, there's no 26th land. I don't think we need it. I looked and did the math on all of these. We have exactly the number of sources we need to hit 90th percentile using Frank Karsten's stat line. So we are fine. We do not need the Plaza of Heroes, as far as I can tell. I would rather have the additional spell, which made its way into the deck in the form of that main board Duress, which I love. The Destroy Evil also made its way into the main board, and as we see, we're on a 2-2 split here between Mastermind and Virtue. I also still like having a couple copies of Shelly. It just wins games. What I love about the sideboard here, and this is where I deviated a little, is to me, this is the hottest tech against soldiers. I don't know why people are playing Path of Peril and Esper Midrange when you have a one-sided Wrath that comes out later and blocks. Like, this is the one-sided Wrath. Yes, if they have Wedding Announcement flipped, it's a problem, but you do have Destroy Evil, you do have ways to deal with it. Last but not least, there is that one Invasion of Amonkhet, and that's really there for the grind. I watched Crokies play that Sultai list. I tried out Invasion of Amonkhet in a number of lists. I really enjoy having one copy in Esper Midrange for that mirror match, where we put it down and we say, okay, here's value, and if we ever get to flip this, it's going to flip into probably another fucking Shelly, which is what we want. So, in the end, I wanted a deck that had game against the entire field. I feel like Esper Midrange has been that deck consistently all season, and it has the ability to slant a couple slots in the main, about as many in the sideboard for what I expect to see the most of. And I expected to see tier 1 archetypes. I expect to see Domain, Soldiers, the Mirror, Mono Red, and one misguided Golgari player that believes for some reason they can beat Domain, which, hey, I did too. I tried for like half a week to figure out how to beat Domain with Golgari. The answer is you have to slant your deck really hard. Going into week 8, I expect Domain to remain at the top, with Esper Mid and Azorius Soldiers firmly entrenched beside it. The tier 2s, I think, will just continue to churn, and Mono Red will capitalize on variance and people discounting it as a tier 1 archetype, leading to a couple unexpected spikes in tournament results. To me, the most interesting deck, though, is Dimir Fae. The list by Charlie looks like an excellent starting place, but I can already see where I want to shave some slots and evolve it further, and I will be curious who can crack that code moving forward. So with the season coming to a close and the spoilers of Ixalan about to be in full swing, will we see Dimir come back to the top? Will control decks finally find a reliable path through all the flash tempo of blue-based midrange, and can Domain be toppled as reigning king? Tune in next week to find out, and until next time, untap, upkeep, resist.
Resist.